Catwoman's prostitute origin. When people talk about Catwoman, they usually picture the sleek burglar, the morally grey anti-hero, Batman's complicated love interest, the queen of Gotham rooftops. She's smart, agile, independent, and always 3 steps ahead. But back in 1987, when Frank Miller reimagined Batman's early years in Batman Year One, Selina Kyle got an origin that still sparks debate today. Instead of being a thrill-seeking jewel thief or a master con artist from the start, Miller portrayed her as a dominatrix living in Gotham's underbelly before deciding to become Catwoman. And yeah, that choice changed how a lot of fans saw the character. In Year One, Selina is introduced as someone working in Gotham's red light district under the control of a violent pimp. She shares an apartment building with a young Holly Robinson who looks up to her. After witnessing Batman's first brutal appearance, Selina becomes inspired. Not inspired by justice, not by morality, but by the symbolism. She sees the power of the costume, the fear, the control, and that's when she crafts her own identity, Catwoman. The implication is that she transitions from one dangerous world to another, trading one form of survival for another, and crime becomes her way out. Now here's where the controversy kicks in. For some readers, this origin was meant to ground Gotham in gritty realism. Miller's version of Gotham is corrupt, filthy, and broken. Everyone is compromised. So giving Selina a background in the sex industry was, in that lens, a way to show she came from the bottom of Gotham's social ladder and clawed her way up. It paints her as a survivor, someone who refused to stay powerless. But for others, it felt kind of unnecessary. Catwoman had decades of history before this, and none of it required reducing her to that starting point. Critics argued that this move reflected a broader issue in Miller's writing. Many of his female characters across different works tend to be hypersexualized, often defined heavily by trauma or exploitation. So when Selina was reintroduced as a dominatrix prostitute, it didn't feel like character depth, especially since Catwoman had always been sensual without needing to be framed through that lens. And the change didn't really add complexity to her motivations, it just made her origin darker in a way that some fans felt was more about tone than storytelling necessity. Of course, later writers quietly stepped away from this interpretation. Subsequent runs reworked Selina's backstory again, often emphasizing poverty, abuse, or street survival without directly tying her to sex work. Yes, DC has never completely erased the Year One origin, but it's rarely the central defining version anymore. It exists, but it's not the default. The torture of James Gordon. Some comic book stories don't just become popular, they become infamous. And few Batman stories sit in that uncomfortable Hall of Fame like Batman, The Killing Joke. It's often praised as one of the greatest Joker stories ever told, but alongside that praise becomes controversy, especially when you look at what happens to James Gordon. Because while Barbara's shooting gets most of the attention, Gordon's psychological torture is just as horrifying, if not more disturbing in some ways. So after Joker shoots and paralyzes Barbara Gordon, the cruelty doesn't stop there. That act wasn't random chaos. It was part of a deliberate plan. Joker kidnaps Commissioner Gordon and drags him to an abandoned carnival, stripping him naked and chaining him up. And then comes the real nightmare. Joker forces him to a twisted funhouse ride surrounded by giant screens displaying explicit, degrading photos of his daughter bleeding and violated. It's not just physical captivity. This is psychological annihilation. The goal isn't to kill Gordon, it is to break him. And that's the key to the whole story. Joker's experiment is about proving a point. He believes that one bad day is enough to drive anyone insane. That all it takes is the right trauma at the right moment, and even the most stable, morally upright man will snap. So he chooses Gordon, arguably Gotham's most incorruptible figure, as his test subject. He doesn't want Gordon dead. He wants him shattered. He wants him to abandon sanity, justice, and morality. He wants proof that the world is as broken as he is. And this was all calculated, of course. Gordon is stripped of dignity, reduced to a spectacle, and forced to confront the suffering of his own child while powerless to help her. It's deeply invasive and intentionally cruel. There's no grand criminal objective, no money, no territory, just suffering for the sake of philosophical argument. And yet, Gordon doesn't break. That's the part people sometimes forget. When Batman finally rescues him, Gordon is traumatized, shaken, and furious, but he's still Gordon. And even tells Batman to bring Joker in by the book, even after everything, even after being psychologically tortured and humiliated beyond imagination. That moment flips Joker's thesis on its head. The Killing Joke isn't just about Joker proving a point, it's about him failing to. Gordon survives the worst day of his life and refuses to become what Joker wants him to be. For many readers, it crossed the line that didn't need to be crossed. It's one thing to explore darkness, it's another to lean into it so heavily that it overshadows everything else. Black Lois Lane. Sometimes comic books try to tackle important social issues, and sometimes they do it in ways that age incredibly poorly. One of the most infamous examples is the 1970s story I Am Curious, Black, from Superman's girlfriend, Lois Lane, issue 106, where Lois Lane literally transforms into a black woman for a day. Yes, that actually happened. And even though the intention was to address racism, the execution has been debated ever since. In the story, Lois wants to report on racism in Metropolis, neighborhood known as Little Africa, but she quickly finds that the black residents don't trust her. Instead of building relationships, interviewing people honestly, or confronting systematic issues through journalism, she decides on a very different approach. With the help from Superman and a Kryptonian machine, Lois temporarily changes her skin color to become a black woman so she can experience racism firsthand. From there, the comic shows Lois facing discrimination, a taxi refuses to pick her up, people treat her differently, and she witnesses prejudice more directly. The narrative frames this as an eye-opening journey, suggesting that by living one day as a black woman, she now understands racial injustice in America, and that's where the discomfort really sets in. The story attempts to promote empathy, but it does so through a transformation gimmick that many readers later compare to blackface in concept, even if not visually exaggerated in the art style. To be fair, context matters. The comic was released during the Civil Rights era, at a time when mainstream superhero books rarely address racism at all. Writer Robert Kanigher appeared to be trying to push DC towards social relevance, and compared to the complete silence many comics maintained on racial inequality, this was at least an attempt to say something. But good intentions don't automatically equal good execution. It's just the idea that a temporary physical change could replicate generations of lived experience, systematic oppression, and cultural identity feels painfully naive today. Racism isn't just road cab drivers or a single bad day. It's structural, historical, and deeply embedded in institutions. Compressing that reality into a one-issue body swap story makes the message feel shallow rather than profound. The murder of Arthur Curry Jr. Death in comics is common. It drives stakes, motivates heroes, and raises emotional cost of every battle. But every now and then, a story goes so far that even long-time readers sit back and say, that was too much. One of the most infamous examples in DC history is the murder of Arthur Curry Jr., Aquaman's infant son, at the hands of Black Manta. And yes, it's exactly as brutal as it sounds. The storyline unfolded in the 1970s within the pages of Aquaman. Black Manta, already established as Aquaman's arch-nemesis, wanted revenge, but instead of targeting Atlantis or engaging in some massive undersea war, he went somewhere far darker. He kidnapped the infant to set up something twisted. Black Manta trapped the baby inside an airtight sphere that slowly filled with air. For an Atlantean infant who could only breathe underwater, that meant suffocation. And then came the ultimatum. Aquaman or Aqualad would have to kill the other in order to save the child. Manta was trying to win a battle. He was trying to shatter Arthur emotionally. He wanted him to choose between his partner and his son, knowing that either outcome would destroy him. It was psychological torment. So Aquaman tries to act, but the situation spirals out of control. He can't bring himself to murder Aqualad in cold blood, and in the time it takes, the worst happens. The sphere completes its grim task. Arthur Curry is left holding the lifeless body of his infant son. It's an image that feels less like superhero fiction and more like something out of a psychological horror story. No dramatic last-second save, no miracle reversal, just loss. And this crossed the line that villains simply shouldn't cross. Superhero comics have always flirted with darkness, but killing a baby slowly and methodically felt like a shock tactic rather than organic storytelling. Black Manta was already a compelling villain. He didn't need to kill a baby to prove how evil he was. The act permanently deepened the hatred between him and Aquaman, but it also left a stain on the tone of the series. That said, the tragedy became a defining moment for Aquaman as a character. It reshaped him. His grief, guilt, and anger influenced how he was written for years afterward, and whether you see it as bold storytelling or unnecessary cruelty, it remains one of the hardest panels to look at in mainstream superhero comics. The sexual assault of Nightwing. Sexual assault in comics is a subject that's always been uncomfortable, and for good reason. Historically, most of these storylines involved male villains abusing female characters, but one of the most infamous cases flipped that dynamic, and it remains deeply controversial to this day. The Assault of Nightwing by Tarantula during the early 2000s, Nightwing Run, written by Devin Grayson. The scene takes place after a brutal confrontation with Blockbuster. Dick Grayson, aka Nightwing, is physically and emotionally shattered. Blockbuster has terrorized Bloodhaven for years, and in this climactic moment, Tarantula executes him while Nightwing is too injured and overwhelmed to intervene. It's already a morally devastating situation. Dick has always drawn a firm line against killing, and watching it happen in front of him leaves him stunned and vulnerable. And that vulnerability is exactly where things take a disturbing turn. In the aftermath, as rain pours down and Nightwing is barely able to stand, Tarantula initiates sex. Dick tells her to stop. He's not in a state to consent, but she ignores him. The comic presents the moment in silhouette against the rain, which only adds to the heaviness of the scene. It's not framed as romantic, it's not mutual, it's coercive and non-consensual. and for many readers, this felt like a betrayal of the character. So what follows? Tarantula shows little remorse. Meanwhile, Nightwing is left confused, traumatized, and deeply shaken. The story doesn't treat him as a traditional victim in the way media often does, and that's part of why the backlash was strong. Male sexual assault survivors are already underrepresented in fiction, and here the event seemed more like a plot device to push Dick into a darker spiral rather than a carefully handled exploration of trauma. Critics argued the storyline blurred the framing too much. Instead of clearly acknowledging the act as assault within the narrative, it lingered in uncomfortable ambiguity, and that ambiguity made many readers feel like the gravity of what happened wasn't properly addressed. Batman abuses Silver St. Cloud. Bruce has survived dozens of reinterpretations over the decades, from grim detective noir to full-on grimdark myth. But not every creative swing lands. One of the most controversial modern portrayals of Batman came from Kevin Smith in Batman the White Geyer. What was meant to be a bold, character-driven exploration of Bruce Wayne became one of the most uncomfortable Batman stories ever printed. Silver St. Cloud isn't a random love interest. She's one of the few people in DC history who figured out Bruce Wayne was Batman on her own. Their relationship in earlier stories was mature, emotionally layered, and built on mutual respect. That's why seeing it unravel in The White Geyer hit so hard. Instead of a complex romance strained by Bruce's obsession with crime fighting, the series pushes things into deeply unsettling territory. Bruce becomes increasingly paranoid and unstable, convinced at one point that Silver might not even be human. The infamous moment comes when Bruce suspects she could be a robot or some kind of imposter, and rather than handling that suspicion with intelligence or restraint like he always does, he physically grabs and roughly handles her to prove she's real. It's framed as paranoia, spiraling out of control, but the visual result is Bruce physically hurting someone he claims to love, and that crossed the line. Batman can be emotionally distant, he can sabotage relationships, but outright physical aggression toward a partner, that's not him. That's not who the character is supposed to be. And this is presented as the main continuity Bruce Wayne unraveling under pressure. The story leans heavily into shock value, explicit dialogue, exaggerated internal monologues, and a version of Bruce that feels more unstable than strategic, and the whole situation was just uncomfortable. Critics of the run argue that Batman works best when his darkness is balanced by control. He's haunted, yes, obsessive, absolutely, but he channels that pain into discipline. In Smith's story, that discipline erodes in ways that feel less like character study and more like provocation. When Bruce becomes physically rough with Silver out of paranoia, it stops feeling like a drama and starts feeling like a betrayal of the character's core. Superman and Wonder Woman. Superheroes having relationships isn't actually new. In fact, when you're talking about DC's so-called Trinity, Superman, Wonder Woman, and Batman, romance has always been part of the conversation. But in The Dark Knight Strikes Again, written by Frank Miller, that romance went in a direction that no one really expected, and definitely didn't forget. Because instead of candlelight dinners or quiet moments in Metropolis, Miller decided that when two god-level beings fall in love, the planet itself should feel it. In this story, Superman and Wonder Woman reach Themyscira after years of tension and shared battles. And of course, they are both incredibly powerful. Superman draws strength from the sun, and Wonder Woman is a demigoddess forged from divine power. So the idea Miller plays with is quite simple. If two beings with that level of strength come together physically, normal human settings just won't survive it. According to the comic, their intimacy literally shakes the earth. The sky cracks with thunder. The ground splits. The ocean surges. It's framed less like romance and more like a mythological event. The visual storytelling doesn't go into explicit detail, but the implication is loud and clear. Their physical connection causes global natural disasters. Earthquakes ripple across continents. Storms rage. Tectonic plates shift. The book treats it almost like a cosmic collision. I mean, it kind of is. Two living forces of nature colliding in a way the planet can barely withstand. It's over-the-top, operatic, and very on-brand for Miller's exaggerated style during that era. Some argue that it was just absurd. The idea that two heroes sworn to protect humanity would be so reckless that their private moment results in worldwide destruction felt widely out of character. Superman is the symbol of restraint and responsibility. Suddenly being part of something that causes mass casualties, that's questionable. And Wonder Woman, the warrior for peace, unleashing catastrophic storms for passion, this clashed hard with how fans traditionally saw them. At the same time, some defenders argue it was meant to be mythic rather than literal, because if you've read the comic, this universe is exaggerated, stylized, and intentionally extreme. Everything is dialed up to 11, the politics, the violence, the personalities. In that context, the earth-moving intimacy is symbolic of gods behaving like gods, not humans, so it's less about physics and more about spectacle here. Arsenal's rampage. Comic books have always tried to tackle real-world issues alongside the capes and explosions, and few DC stories are as famous for that as Snowbirds Don't Fly, the 1971 arc where Roy Harper, then known as Speedy, was revealed to be addicted to heroin. It was shocking for its time, it was raw, and even if it wrapped up a bit too neatly, it treated addiction as something serious and painful. Fast forward decades later though, and Roy's relapse, this time as Arsenal, didn't land with the same weight. Instead, it spiraled into something far more chaotic and controversial. By the time of his relapse, Roy wasn't just a sidekick anymore. He had lost an arm. He had seen his daughter die. His life has been shattered in ways that would break almost anyone. So the setup for a relapse made emotional sense, trauma, grief, and guilt, pushing him back toward drugs. That's tragically believable. So the problem wasn't the concept. It was again the execution. And let me tell you, so instead of a grounded exploration of addiction and recovery, this story leaned hard into shock imagery and psychological horror. Under the influence, Roy goes on a violent rampage. In one of the most infamous scenes, he hallucinates that a group of thugs are threatening his daughter, but she isn't there. In reality, Roy is cradling a dead cat, completely detached from reality. The image is grotesque and disturbing, and not in a thoughtful way, but in a way that feels designed purely to horrify. Snowbirds Don't Fly may have been a product of its time, but it treated Roy's struggle with a degree of empathy. His relapse arc, on the other hand, turned addiction into a visual spectacle. Instead of focusing on internal pain, support systems, or the slow unraveling of sobriety, it jumps straight to madness. Batman ultimately takes him down, which further shifts the focus away from Roy's struggle and towards spectacle. So this portrayal didn't just miss the mark, it undercut the legacy of his original story. Addiction isn't just hallucinations and violent breakdowns, it's quite desperation, self-loathing, isolation, turning his relapse into a horror scene, stripped away the nuance that made his first arc meaningful. Rainbow Girl. If you ever want an example of how weird and sometimes painfully tone deaf Silver Age comics could get, look no further than Rainbow Girl. Debuting in 1963 in Adventure Comics, she was introduced as an applicant for the Legion of Superheroes, and from the start, the character felt like a walking bundle of stereotypes rather than a fully formed hero. Her real name was Dory, and she's from the planet Zolnar, and her dream, it was to become a famous actress. Joining the Legion wasn't about heroism, it was about boosting her publicity. She had already won a beauty contest before applying to the team, which this story presents almost as a punchline. It's very much that old school trope, the girl who cares more about showbiz than substance. Then there are her powers. This character could manipulate emotions by projecting different colors of the rainbow, each triggering a different emotional response. Emotional manipulation is powerful, but the way it was framed leaned heavily into ideas about feminine mood swings and hormonal unpredictability. It was treated more like a gag. The Legion was full of heroes with big, bold abilities and serious motivations. Meanwhile, Rainbow Girl's application is rejected, and she's often played for laughs. Instead of being allowed to grow, she's written as scatterbrained and superficial. It's a reflection of that era's storytelling norms, where many female characters were either love interests, comic relief, or defined primarily by appearance. To DC's credit, later interpretations softened some of those rough edges. In modern appearances, Rainbow Girl has been portrayed with more nuance, and her powers are treated with more legitimacy. Emotional spectrum manipulation can be incredibly dangerous if written seriously. Just look at how later DC stories handle emotion-based powers through concepts like the Lantern Corps. So the raw idea behind Rainbow Girl was never the problem, it was the execution.